What does it take to conquer death? Not by dodging it, but by looking it in the eye and laughing. Imagine a man, a thinker with ideas sharper than any sword, facing a punishment so savage it's hard to even picture. A vengeful king has ordered him to be pounded to death, ground into dust by iron pestles in a giant stone mortar. The king doesn't just want to kill him, he wants to erase him, to obliterate his existence through agony. But as the first blow lands, something unbelievable happens. The man, instead of screaming, just looks his tormentor in the eye and mocks him. They crushed his bones, but they couldn't get to his spirit. This is the story of Anaxarchus, the philosopher who taught a tyrant, and the world that the mind can rise above any pain the body is forced to endure. His last moments were a monument to a radical idea, that true freedom isn't about your body, but about your mind. To understand how a man could find the strength to crack a joke at such a horrifying end, we have to go back in time, to an age of titans, to the world of Alexander the Great, and into the brilliant, unbreakable mind of a philosopher they called the Happy Man. To really get Anaxarchus, you have to understand the world that made him. He was born around 380 BC in Abdera, a Greek city in Thrace famous for two things: its people, who were supposedly a bit dim-witted, and, funny enough, for producing some of the most revolutionary thinkers of the ancient world. The most famous of them was Democritus, the father of atomism. This was the intellectual world Anaxarchus grew up in. The core idea of atomism, which he would later adopt, was that everything in the universe, from the stars in the sky to the thoughts in our heads, is made of tiny, indestructible particles called atoms, all moving around in an infinite void. Nothing comes from nothing, and nothing is ever truly destroyed. It just changes form as atoms crash, combine, and break apart. This wasn't just some abstract science project. It had huge philosophical consequences. If your body is just a temporary cluster of atoms, a vessel, a container, then what is the self? What's the consciousness living inside? This way of thinking laid the groundwork for a powerful idea: the separation of the physical body from the mind or soul. It was a concept Anaxarchus would push to its absolute limit. And he didn't just accept atomism, he mixed it with a heavy dose of skepticism. Anaxarchus studied under guys like Metrodorus of Chios, a man who famously said he knew nothing, not even the fact that he knew nothing. This skepticism led Anaxarchus to a wild conclusion about reality itself. The historian Sextus Empiricus wrote that Anaxarchus compared our experience of the world to scene painting. He suggested that what we think is real might be no more substantial than a dream or a madman's delusion. Think of it this way. In a play, the painted backdrop of a forest looks real from your seat. You buy into it for the show, but it's not real. It's just a clever illusion. Anaxarchus proposed that our entire reality might be like that. And if you can't be sure the world you see is real, how can you let anything in that world, pain, pleasure, power, have any real control over you? This blend of atomism and skepticism created a totally unique outlook. It was a worldview that encouraged a kind of indifference, or adiaphora, to life's ups and downs. But this didn't mean Anaxarchus was some hermit who hid from the world, far from it. Unlike his famous travel buddy and student, Pyrrho, who would go on to found the school of skepticism and live a withdrawn life, Anaxarchus was known to enjoy luxury and jump right into the action. He didn't see a problem here. If the world is a stage, why not play your part with everything you've got? You can enjoy the feast, wear the nice clothes, and hang out with powerful people, all while knowing that none of it has any ultimate value. This made him a fascinating, complicated guy. He was a man who believed the world was probably an illusion, but was still right in the middle of its biggest dramas. And in the 4th century BC, there was no bigger stage than the court of the most powerful man on earth, Alexander the Great. Anaxarchus's choice to join Alexander's campaign in Asia would define his life, test his philosophy, and ultimately lead him to that fateful showdown in Cyprus. The relationship between Anaxarchus and Alexander the Great was one of history's most fascinating partnerships. It was a mix of incredible power and fearless intellect, a bond that ancient sources describe in contradictory ways. On one hand, Anaxarchus was a trusted friend, a philosopher in a conqueror's war council. On the other, he was a sharp-tongued critic who wasn't afraid to challenge a man who was starting to think he was a god. So why would a king with the world's greatest army need a philosopher? For Alexander, who had been taught by Aristotle himself, philosophy wasn't just a hobby. It was a tool to understand the world he was trying to conquer. Anaxarchus, with his down-to-earth and worldly philosophy, was the perfect intellectual sparring partner. He wasn't some stiff moralist who'd lecture the king about his behavior. Instead, he offered a philosophy fit for a conqueror, a way to handle the insane highs of victory and the crushing lows of war with a cool head. Plutarch tells us that Anaxarchus's calm nature often reminded Alexander of the fleeting nature of worldly honors. In the middle of unbelievable success, the philosopher was a living reminder that glory, like everything else, doesn't last. He once famously told Alexander that there were an infinite number of worlds, a thought that supposedly made the king weep because he hadn't even conquered one yet. Whether that story is literally true or not, it gets to the heart of their dynamic. Anaxarchus was there to stretch Alexander's mind beyond the battlefield, forcing him to see his own ambition against the vastness of the cosmos. But Anaxarchus's most important job was to keep Alexander grounded, especially as the king's ego began to reach godlike proportions. After being declared the son of Zeus Ammon in Egypt, Alexander started demanding that his Greek and Macedonian followers perform proskynesis, Persian custom of bowing down before the king. For the fiercely independent Greeks, this was something you only did for gods, and it created huge tension in his court. Some, like the historian Callisthenes, fought against it, calling it a betrayal of Greek tradition. Anaxarchus, ever the pragmatist, reportedly argued that it made sense to worship Alexander as a god while he was alive, given his incredible achievements. This has led some historians, like Plutarch, to paint Anaxarchus as a simple flatterer. But that view misses the subtle, subversive genius of his philosophy. A much more revealing story told by Diogenes Laertius shows where he really stood. One time, after Alexander was wounded in battle, Anaxarchus saw the king bleeding. Pointing to the wound, he delivered one of history's sharpest reality checks. See the blood of a mortal, not ichor, such as flows from the veins of the immortal gods. That's not something a suck-up says. It was a brilliant public performance of his core belief. In front of his men, he was telling the most powerful man in the world that no matter how much power you have, you're still just a man, a temporary collection of atoms, bleeding mortal blood. He even offered comfort through this same lens. After Alexander, in a drunken rage, killed his close friend Clytus, he was wrecked with guilt, locking himself away for days. It was Anaxarchus who finally got through to him. He didn't offer empty words. Instead, he reminded the weeping king that, as the conqueror of the world, he himself was now the definition of justice. He was above the empty opinion and judgment of regular men. This might sound like enabling a tyrant, but from Anaxarchus's skeptical view, he was just pointing out a fact of their reality. Alexander's actions had put him outside normal laws, and torturing himself with guilt was pointless because justice and law were human ideas, not absolute truths. This was the heart of his advice, a radical pragmatism born from skepticism. He was the happiness man, the eudaimonikos. Not because he was clueless, but because he'd found contentment by understanding that things aren't what they seem. He taught Alexander that you could be a king, a conqueror, even a god on the world stage, as long as you never forgot it was just a part you were playing. But that sharp tongue and fearless wit, which worked so well with one king, would be his downfall with another. The moment that sealed Anaxarchus's fate didn't happen on a battlefield, but at a dinner party. Around 331 BC, Alexander the Great was holding a feast in the city of Tyre. All the local kings and rulers who owed him their power were there. Among them was a man named Nicocreon, the tyrant of Cyprus. Cyprus was a key strategic island, and Nicocreon ruled it for Alexander. Like a lot of local leaders in the Hellenistic world, his power was both huge and fragile. He was a king, but he answered to a bigger king. This kind of position creates a special kind of insecurity, a desperate need for respect, and a very thin skin. Anaxarchus, as usual, was at the feast, watching all the pomp and politics with his philosopher's eye. At some point, Alexander turned to him and asked what he thought of the amazing spread. This was Anaxarchus's moment. He could have given a polite kiss-up answer, but that wasn't him. With everyone's attention on him, he fired back a line dripping with philosophical scorn. According to Diogenes Laertius, he said, "Everything, O king, is magnificent. There is only one thing lacking." He paused, letting the room hang on his words before dropping the punchline, that the head of some satrap should be served up at table. To most of the guests, this might have sounded like a dark joke about the brutal nature of power. But Anaxarchus was staring right at Nicocreon when he said it. The insult was direct and deadly. He wasn't just making a sick joke. He was making a deep philosophical point wrapped in a vicious personal attack. In Anaxarchus's world, a tyrant like Nicocreon, a man whose whole identity was based on worldly power and the fear he commanded, was the ultimate fake. His authority was a made-up rule, his wealth just a temporary pile of atoms. By suggesting his head should be served up like a fish, Anaxarchus was reducing him to nothing more than matter, a piece of meat to be eaten. He was telling Nicocreon and everyone at the table that his power was a joke and his life was as disposable as the dinner they were eating. For a philosopher who thought the world was just scene painting, this was just stating the facts. For a proud and insecure tyrant, it was a humiliation he would never forgive. Nicocreon said nothing. He couldn't. Reacting would have shown weakness in front of Alexander. But he held on to that insult, letting it rot into a cold, deep-seated hatred. For years, as long as Alexander was alive, Anaxarchus was safe. He was the great king's friend, untouchable. Nicocreon could only wait. But empires, like people, don't last forever. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. His massive empire immediately started to crack as his generals fought for control. The shield that had protected Anaxarchus for a decade disappeared overnight. The world suddenly became a much more dangerous place for a man who had made powerful enemies. Years went by. Anaxarchus went on with his life as a philosopher, maybe thinking the whole thing was forgotten. But tyrants have long memories. Fate, or as Anaxarchus might have put it, a random collision of atoms, stepped in. While at sea, Anaxarchus's ship was wrecked in a storm, and he washed ashore on the one place in the world he should have avoided, the island of Cyprus. He was now in the territory of the man he had so publicly shamed. Nicocreon, hearing that his old enemy had literally fallen into his lap, grabbed his chance for revenge. The philosopher was captured and dragged before the tyrant. The seeds of vengeance, planted at a banquet years ago, were about to bear horrific fruit. The story of Anaxarchus is a powerful reminder that philosophy isn't just for dusty books. It's a guide for how to live and, ultimately, how to die. Thinkers throughout history have wrestled with the same questions of meaning, suffering, and freedom that defined his final moments. If you find these deep dives into the history of ideas fascinating and want to hear more stories about the philosophers who shaped our world, please take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to you. The showdown between Anaxarchus and Nicocreon wasn't just a prisoner facing his captor. It was a clash of two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. On one side was Nicocreon, a man whose entire reality was the physical world, his power over land, his control over people, his ability to cause pain and death. On the other was Anaxarchus, a man who'd spent his life arguing that the physical world was secondary, an illusion with no real power over the self. Nicocreon didn't want a quick death for the philosopher. He wanted a death that was also a counter-argument. He wanted to prove that the body is everything, that pain is the one true reality, and that under enough torment, any philosophy will crumble. So he came up with a punishment of horrifying, symbolic cruelty. Anaxarchus was to be thrown into a giant stone mortar and pounded to death with iron pestles. It was a death designed to literally unmake a person, to crush and grind them until nothing was left. It was the physical version of obliteration. The guards dragged Anaxarchus to the mortar. The heavy iron pestles were lifted. For Nicocreon, this was his moment of victory. He would finally shut up the mocking philosopher and prove that his power, the power of brute force, was the only thing that mattered. But as the first crushing blows landed, Anaxarchus did something Nicocreon could never have seen coming. He showed no fear. He didn't scream in pain. Instead, with his body being broken, he looked at the tyrant and, with what little strength he had, spoke one of the most defiant lines in the history of philosophy. As recorded by Diogenes Laertius, he yelled, "Pound, pound the pouch of Anaxarchus. You do not pound Anaxarchus himself." Let's just stop and appreciate the genius of that line. In one incredible sentence, Anaxarchus turned his entire philosophy into a weapon. The pouch, the bag of Anaxarchus. That was his body. It was just the container, the temporary pile of atoms that he lived in. Nicocreon could do whatever he wanted to that pouch. He could smash it, pulverize it, turn it into mush. But Anaxarchus himself, the mind, the consciousness, the real self, was untouchable. It existed somewhere a tyrant's physical power couldn't reach. He was demonstrating, in the most graphic way possible, the core of his beliefs. He was living the separation of mind and body. The pain was happening to the pouch, not to him. He was proving that the self is not the body. By mocking the very act of his own murder, he ripped control of the narrative away from Nicocreon. The tyrant wanted the torture to be a show of his power. Anaxarchus turned it into a philosophy lecture given at the moment of his own death. He transformed his execution from a punishment into a proof. He showed that physical pain has no hold on a mind that refuses to accept it as the ultimate reality. This state of mind, this freedom from being disturbed, was what the Greeks called apatheia, and the deep contentment he found in it, even while being tortured, was the ultimate expression of eudaimonia, the state of flourishing or happiness that had earned him his nickname. He was the happy man, not because he avoided suffering, but because he had made it irrelevant. The tyrant, furious, was being defeated by his own victim. Every blow of the pestle meant to destroy Anaxarchus only proved his point. Nicocreon was just pounding away at a bag of flesh and bone, while the philosopher's spirit stayed free, defiant, and strangely victorious. The harder he tried to break him, the more unbreakable Anaxarchus became. Nicocreon was losing it. His big, brutal execution was blowing up in his face. The philosopher who should have been begging for mercy was using his last breaths to mock him, to philosophize, to win. The tyrant's physical power was useless against the power of an idea. Furious and desperate to shut the man up, Nicocreon gave a new order: cut out his tongue. If he couldn't break his spirit, he'd at least stop his words. He would take away the tool of his defiance. The guards moved in to do it, but Anaxarchus had one last act of rebellion left. He had proven his mind was beyond the tyrant's grasp. Now he would prove his body was still his to command. Before the guards could grab him, Anaxarchus did something truly shocking. He bit down on his own tongue with all his strength, severing it completely. Then he spat the bloody piece of flesh right in the tyrant's face. This wasn't an act of insanity or desperation. It was the ultimate act of self-control. It was a final, symbolic gesture that screamed, "You can't take anything from me that I don't give you. You can't silence me, I'll silence myself on my own terms. You don't control my body, I do." By biting off his own tongue, he robbed Nicocreon of even that last, petty victory. The tyrant wanted to silence him, but Anaxarchus did it himself, turning a punishment into a final, bloody exclamation point on his life's philosophy. He had faced the ultimate test and hadn't cracked. He had met total tyranny with total intellectual freedom. Diogenes Laertius, so moved by the story, wrote an epitaph for the Philosopher that perfectly sums up how pointless Nicocreon's cruelty was. "Pound Nicocreon as hard as you like. It is but a pouch. Pound on. Anaxarchus's self long since is housed with Zeus. Persephone will utter words like these: 'Out upon thee, villainous miller.'" The story of his death became a legend, a benchmark for later schools of philosophy like the Stoics, who also promoted the ideal of being indifferent to pain and what happens to you. Anaxarchus showed, in the most extreme way possible, that the fortress of the mind can stand unconquered, even as the city walls of the body are ground to dust. The story of Anaxarchus is a harsh and brutal one, but its lasting power is in its deep message of hope and resilience. He taught us that our circumstances don't have to control our inner peace. Pain, injustice, and fear are strong forces, but they are external. The real source of freedom, contentment, and courage is inside our own minds. His philosophy, that mix of physical detachment from atomism and intellectual freedom from skepticism, gave him a shield that no weapon could break. By famously declaring that his torturer was only pounding a pouch, and not the real Anaxarchus, he drew a line between the body and the self that has echoed through centuries of human thought. He showed that it's possible to endure the unimaginable by understanding that what happens to our physical selves isn't the same as what happens to us. His final defiant act of spitting his own tongue at his tormentor was a gruesome but powerful symbol of ultimate self-control. It was a declaration that even when facing complete destruction, the human spirit can hold on to its power to choose and its unbreakable will to be free. Anaxarchus's bones were crushed, but his spirit, captured forever in this incredible story, was never broken. The life and death of Anaxarchus asks a question of every single one of us. In our own lives, when we face our own, hopefully much less dramatic, struggles, where do we draw the line between what happens to us and who we are? It's a question philosophers have been tackling for thousands of years. If you want to keep exploring these timeless questions and the extraordinary lives of the people who dare to answer them, make sure you're subscribed. And now I'll leave you with a final thought for the comments. What do you think is the pouch and what is the self? Let me know below. Thanks for watching.